divide my presentation into three parts. In the first one, I will speak about the Spanish roots of Austrian economics, especially considering that we have here St. Thomas Aquinas. Secondly, I will introduce, following the old Austrian tradition, a dynamic concept of economic efficiency. And third, I will try to demonstrate the intimate relationship that exists between ethics and efficiency in the capitalist system. So now let me begin by making a few points on what I think is the true origin of the Austrian School of Economics, which should be traced back to the works of the Spanish scholastics of what is known in Spanish Siglo de Oro Español, in English the Spanish Golden Age, which ran from the mid-16th century through the 17th century. The great Austrian scholar I just mentioned, Murray Newton Rothbard, first developed the thesis that the Austrian school is of Spanish origin in 1974. And also the Nobel Prize winner, Friedrich von Hayek, shared this view, particularly after meeting Bruno Leoni, the Italian scholar and author of the book Freedom and the Law. These two scholars, Hayek and Leoni, met in the 1950s, and Leoni convinced Hayek that the intellectual origins of classical economic liberalism lay in Mediterranean Europe and not in Scotland. I personally have a letter from Hayek dated January 7, 1979, when we were organizing a general meeting of the Montpellier Society precisely here in Salamanca 30 years ago, exactly 30 years ago. In this letter, Hayek writes that Rothbard, and I quote, demonstrates that the basic principles of the theory of the competitive market were worked out by the Spanish scholastics of the 16th century, and that economic liberalism was not designed by the Calvinists, but by the Spanish Jesuits and Dominicans. Hayek concludes his letter by telling us the following, quote, "I can assure you from my personal knowledge of the sources that Rothbard's case is extremely strong." Now, who were these Spanish intellectual ancestors of the modern free market movement of the Austrian school? Most of them were scholastics teaching morals and theology here at the University of the city of Salamanca. These scholastics were mainly either Dominicans or Jesuits, and they were able to articulate the subjectivist, dynamic, and libertarian tradition, which 250 years later was to be stressed by Karl Menger and his followers of the Austrian School of Economics. Let us recall some of their main contributions. Perhaps the first author to be mentioned should be Diego de Covarrubias y Leiva. Diego de Covarrubias was born in 1512. He was the son of a famous architect, and he became bishop of the city of Segovia and minister of King Philip II. If you have the opportunity to visit the city of Toledo this weekend, next weekend, I recommend you to tour the museum of the great Spanish painter El Greco, because there you will see a stunning portrait of Covarrubias, who in 1554 set forth better than anyone before him the subjectivist theory of value, which is the foundation of all free market principles. Specifically, Covarrubias concludes that, quote, "The value of an article does not depend on its essential nature, but on the subjective estimation of men, even if that estimation is foolish." And he adds that in the Indies, in America, wheat is dearer than in Spain because men esteem it more highly, though the nature, the objective nature of the wheat is the same in both places. Another important author is Luis Saravia de la Calle, who was the first Spanish scholastic to demonstrate that prices determine costs and not vice versa. Saravia de la Calle also has the special merit of having written his main work in Spanish, not in Latin. Its title is instrucción de mercaderes, in English, instruction to merchants, to entrepreneurs. And there we read that, quote, those who measure the just price by the labor, costs, and risk incurred by the person who deals in the merchandise are greatly in error. The just price is found not by counting the cost, but by common subjective estimation. Saravia de la Calle is also a great critic of fractional reserve banking. He maintains that receiving interest from a bank is incompatible with the nature of a demand deposit, and that in any case a fee should be paid to the banker for the custody and safekeeping of the money entrusted to him. A similar conclusion is reached by another famous Spanish scholastic, Martín Azpilcueta. Azpilcueta was also known as Doctor Navarro because he was born in Navarra, the northeastern autonomous region of Spain, famous for the encierros, a festival held in the region's capital city of Pamplona, where every July people ran in front of the bulls at great risk to their lives. Azpilcueta was born the year following the discovery of America, in 1493. Lived to be 94-year-old, and is especially famous for explaining the quantity theory of money for the first time in 1556. Azpilcueta observed the effects on Spanish prices of the massive inflow of precious metals from America and declared the following, quote, experience shows that in France, where there is less money than in Spain, bread, wine, clothes, and labor cost much less. And even when there was less money in Spain, saleable items and the labor of men were given for much less than after the Indies were discovered and covered Spain with gold and silver. The reason is that money is worth more when and where it is scarce than when and where it is abundant. So the Spanish scholastics also gain a clear insight into the true nature of market prices and the impossibility of attaining an economic equilibrium. The Jesuit cardinal, Juan de Lugo, wondering what the equilibrium price could be, as early as 1643, reached the conclusion that the equilibrium depends on such a large number of specific circumstances that only God can know it. In Latin, he stated, pretium justum mathematicum licet soli Deo notum. And another Jesuit, Juan de Salas, also cardinal, with regard to the possibility that an authority, the state, the government, could come to know the specific information of the market, asserted that it is so complex that, in Latin, quas exacte comprehenderet ponderare Dei est non hominum. In English, that only God, not men, can understand it exactly. Furthermore, the Spanish scholastics were the first to introduce the dynamic concept of competition, what in Latin they call concurrentium, which is best understood as a process of rivalry among entrepreneurs. For instance, Jerónimo Castillo de Bobadilla in 1547 wrote that, quote, prices will go down by an abundance of sellers and by the rivalry and competition among them. Like Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and most members of the Austrian school who are naturally prone to be classical liberals, the subjectivist Spanish scholastics tended to defend strong libertarian positions in political matters. For instance, the founder of international law, the Dominican Francisco de Vitoria, buried just by this room, began the Spanish scholastic tradition of denouncing the conquest, and particularly the enslavement of the Indians by the Spanish in the New World, thus reviving the idea that natural law is morally superior to the mere might of the state. This natural law tradition was further developed by the great libertarian Jesuit Juan de Mariana, who gives the name to our institute. In his book on the alteration of money, in Latin De Monetae Mutatione, published exactly 400 years ago, in 1609, he condemns as robbery any government debasement of coins. Mariana also maintained in his well-known theory of tyrannies that any individual citizen can justly assassinate a governor who imposes taxes without the people's consent, or seizes the property of individuals and squanders it, or prevents a meeting of a democratic parliament. The only doctrine in which I disagree with Mariana is his condemnation of the typical Spanish fiesta of bullfighting. But consider that I am the grandson of a famous Spanish bullfighter, so probably I'm not too impartial on this matter. Now, let me remind you that in the 16th century, the Emperor Charles V, who was the king of Spain, sent his brother Ferdinand I to be the king, or better, the Archduke of Austria. And etymologically, Austria means eastern part of the empire, which in those days comprised almost all of continental Europe, with the sole exception of France, which remained an island surrounded by Spanish forces. Now, you will understand the origin and the intellectual influence the Spanish scholastics exerted on the Austrian school. This was not pure coincidence or a mere whim of history, but originated from the intimate historical, political, and cultural relations which arose beginning in the 1500s between Spain and Austria, and which would continue for several centuries. Italy, indeed, also played an important role in this connection, acting as a cultural, economic, and financial bridge over which the relations between the two farthest points of the empire, Spain and Austria, flowed. So as you see, there are very strong arguments to support the thesis that at least at its roots, the Austrian school is a truly Spanish school. Indeed, I think the greatest merit of the founder of the Austrian school, Karl Menger, was to rediscover and take up this continental Catholic tradition of Spanish scholastic thought, which was almost forgotten due to the negative, very negative, Guido, influence of Adam Smith and his followers of the British classical school. To quote Professor Erlanger, I do not need never water. Thank you, anyhow. To quote Professor Erlanger, and I would like to send a great hello to him from here, from Salamanca. Please convey to him when you come back to Auburn. To quote Professor Erlanger in his review of Rothbard's last book on the history of economic thought, quote, Giger wrote, Adam Smith dropped earlier contributions about subjective value, entrepreneurship, and emphasis on real-world market and pricing, and replaced it all with a labor theory of value and a dominant focus on the long-run natural price equilibrium, a world where entrepreneurship was assumed out of existence. Adam Smith mixed up Calvinism with economics, as in supporting usury prohibition and distinguishing between productive and unproductive occupations. Adam Smith lapsed from the laissez-faire of several 18th century Spanish, French, Italian economists, introducing many waffles and qualifications. And Smith's work was unsystematic and plagued by contradictions. End of quote, and I think that very probably Smith went to the hell. Although the mercy of God is almost infinite, so who knows? Fortunately, despite the overwhelming intellectual imperialism of the British classical school, the continental, subjectivist, free market tradition was never totally forgotten. Several economists like Cantillon, Turgot, and Say kept the torch of subjectivism and entrepreneurial analysis burning. Even in Spain, during the years of decline in the 18th and 19th centuries, the old scholastic tradition survived, in spite of the typical inferiority complex toward the British intellectual world at that time. We find proof of this in the fact that another Spanish Catholic writer solved the paradox of value and clearly set forth the theory of marginal utility 27 years earlier than Karl Menger did. His name was Jaime Balmes. Balmes was born in Catalonia, which is a part of Spain, as a matter of fact. I remember you. He was born in Catalonia in 1810 and passed away in 1848. During his very short life, he became the most important Spanish Thomist philosopher of his time. A few years before his death, on September 7, 1844, he published an article entitled True Idea of Value or Thoughts on the Origin, Nature, and Variety of Prices, in which he solved the paradox of value and clearly set forth the idea of marginal utility. Balmes asks himself, quote, "Why is a precious stone worth more than a piece of bread?" And he answers, "It is not difficult to explain, since the value of a thing is determined by its utility. If the number of means of satisfying a need increases, the need for any one of them in particular decreases. As it is possible to choose among many, none of them is indispensable. For this reason, a necessary relationship exists between an increase or decrease in value and the shortage or abundance of a thing." End of quote. In this way, Balmes was able to close the cycle of the continental Catholic tradition of subjectivism, which could then be completed a few years later by Karl Menger and enhanced by his followers of the Austrian School of Economics. So we can conclude that to a large extent we owe to these great thinkers of the Spanish Golden Age the current worldwide revival of free market liberalism and of the Austrian School of Economics. Now, let us proceed with the second part of my presentation. I'm going to criticize the mainstream static concept of economic efficiency, which I propose to replace with a typically Austrian concept of dynamic efficiency. So, the term efficiency derives etymologically from the Latin verb ex facio, which means to obtain something from. The application to economics of this concept of efficiency as the ability to obtain something from predates the Roman world and can even be traced back to ancient Greece, where the term oikonomia in Greek was first used to refer to the efficient management of the family home. Now let us remember how Xenophon, in his work on economics, which was written 380 years before Christ, explains that there are two different ways to increase the family estate, and each is equivalent to a different concept of efficiency. The first corresponds with the static concept of efficiency and consists of the sound management of the available or given resources to prevent them from being wasted. According to Xenophon, the best way to achieve this static efficiency is by keeping the home in good order. However, along with the concept of static efficiency, Xenophon introduces a different concept that I will call dynamic efficiency, which consists of the attempt of increase one's estate through entrepreneurial creativity, that is, by trade and speculation, more than by the effort to avoid wasting the resources already available. This tradition of clearly distinguishing between the two different concepts of efficiency, the static and the dynamic, survived even until the Middle Ages. For example, Saint Bernardine of Siena wrote that the profit of merchants was justified not only by the sound management of their already given resources, but also and mainly by the assumption of the risks and dangers. In Latin, they wrote pericula, perils, which arise from any entrepreneurial speculation. Unfortunately, the development of mechanical physics, which began by the modern age, had a very negative influence on the evolution of economic thought, especially after the 19th century, when the idea of dynamic efficiency was almost entirely forgotten in economics. Both the Austrian Hans Meyer before the Second World War and Philip Mirowski nowadays have stressed stressed that mainstream neoclassical economics developed as a pure copy of 19th century mechanical physics, using the same formal method, but replacing the concept of energy with that of utility, and applying the same principles of conservation, maximization of the result, and minimization of waste. The author most representative of this very negative trend was Leon Walras, who, for instance, in his paper Economics and Mechanics, published in 1909, claimed that the mathematical formulas of his book Elements of Pure Economics are identical to those of mathematical physics. In short, the influence of mechanical physics eradicated the creative, speculative, and dynamic dimension which was implicit in the idea of economic efficiency from its very beginning. And all that remained was the reductionist, static aspect, which consists solely of minimizing the waste of already known or given economic resources. And this change occurred despite the fact that neither resources nor technology are given in real life, but actually do vary continually as a result of entrepreneurial creativity. The reductionist concept of static efficiency had an immense theoretical and practical influence in the 20th century. For instance, the Fabian socialists Sidney and Beatrice Webb provide a good example. This married couple were shocked by the waste they believed was produced in the capitalist system, and they founded the London School of Economics in an effort to champion the socialist reform of capitalism. The object of such a socialist reform would be to eliminate waste and make the economic system efficient. The Webbs later made no secret of their warm admiration for the efficiency they believed they observed in Soviet Russia, to the point that Beatrice even declared, quote, "I fell in love with Soviet communism." Another noted author to be entirely influenced by the static concept of economic efficiency was John Maynard Keynes himself, who in his introduction to the 1936 German edition of his General Theory expressly states that his typical Keynesian economic policy proposals, quote, "are more easily adapted to the conditions of a totalitarian state," like Hitler's one. Keynes also highly praised the book Soviet Communism, which Sidney and Beatrice Webb had published 3 years earlier. Furthermore, in the 1920s and 1930s, the static concept of economic efficiency became the focal point for a whole new discipline, which came to be known as welfare economics, and which grew from alternative approaches, of which the Pareto approach is the most well-known. From a Paretian perspective, let us remember, an economic system is in a state of efficiency if no one can be made better off without making someone else worse off. Our main criticism of welfare economics is that it reduces the problem of economic efficiency to a simple mathematical problem of maximization, in which all the economic data are assumed to be given and constant. However, both assumptions are entirely wrong. The data are continually changing as a result of entrepreneurial creativity. And precisely for that reason, we need to introduce a new concept, that of dynamic efficiency, understood as the capacity to foster both entrepreneurial creativity as well as entrepreneurial coordination. In other words, dynamic efficiency consists of the entrepreneurial capacity to discover or create profit opportunities, as well as the capacity to coordinate and overcome any social discoordinations or maladjustments. In terms of neoclassical economics, the goal of dynamic efficiency should not be to move the system toward the so-called production possibility frontier, but rather to enhance entrepreneurial creativity and thus to continually shift toward the right, the production possibility curve. The word entrepreneurship derives etymologically from the Latin term imprehendo, which means to discover, to see, to realize, to grasp something. In this sense, we may define entrepreneurship as the typical human ability to recognize opportunities for subjective profit which appear in the environment and to act accordingly to take advantage of them. Entrepreneurship, therefore, involves a special alertness, which the Webster's dictionary defines as, quote, the ability to be watchful, vigilant. Also fully applicable to the idea of entrepreneurship is the verb to speculate, which comes also from the Latin word specula, which refers to the towers from which lookouts could see into the distance to detect anything that approached. Every entrepreneurial action not only creates and transmits new information, but also coordinates the previously discoordinated behavior of economic agents. Whenever someone discovers or creates a profit opportunity and buys a certain resource cheap and sells it dear, he harmonizes the previously discoordinated behavior of the owners of the resource, who very probably were squandering and wasting it, with the behavior of those in need of that resource. Therefore, creativity and coordination are two sides of the same, I would say, entrepreneurial coin. Now, from a dynamic standpoint, an individual, a company, an institution, or even an entire economic system will be more efficient the more it promotes entrepreneurial creativity and coordination. And from this dynamic perspective, the truly important goal is not so much to prevent the waste of certain means considered known and given, as it is continually discover and create new ends and means. For a more extensive treatment of this entire matter, I recommend you the principal works of Mises, Hayek, Kirchner, and Rothbard on the idea of the market as a dynamic process driven by entrepreneurship, and on the notion of competition as a process of discovery and creativity. In my opinion, these Austrian authors provide us with the most exact concept of dynamic efficiency, which contrasts with the more imperfect concept of dynamic efficiency developed, for instance, both by Joseph Alois Schumpeter and Douglas North. North and Schumpeter offer totally opposite perspectives. While Schumpeter exclusively considers the aspect of entrepreneurial creativity and its destructive power, which he calls the process of creative destruction, Douglas North concentrates on the other aspect, which he calls adaptive efficiency, or the coordinating capacity of entrepreneurship. Now we see that the true Austrian concept of dynamic efficiency, that developed by Mises, Hayek, Kirchner, and Rothbard, combines both the creative and the coordinating dimensions, which Schumpeter and North study only in a separate, partial, and reductionist manner. And now, third and finally, let us concentrate on the intimate relationship that exists between ethics and the concept of dynamic efficiency, which I have just presented. Mainstream neoclassical economic theory rests on the idea that information is objective and given, either in certain or probabilistic terms, and that the issues of utility maximization have absolutely no connection with moral considerations. Furthermore, the dominant static viewpoint led to the conclusion that resources are in a sense given and known, and therefore the economic problem of their distribution was deemed separate and different from the issue of their production. Granted, if resources are given, it is vitally important to inquire into the best way to allocate among different people both the available means of production and the consumer goods that result from them. This whole approach collapses like a stack of cards if we adhere to the dynamic concept of market processes, the theory of entrepreneurship, and the notion of dynamic efficiency I just have explained. From this perspective, every human being has a unique creative capacity that continually enables him to perceive and discover new profit opportunities. Entrepreneurship consists of the typically human ability to create and discover new ends and means. and is the most important characteristic of human nature, of our human nature. If ends, means, and resources are not given, but are continually created from nothing as a result of the entrepreneurial action of human beings, clearly the fundamental ethical problem is no longer how to justly distribute what already exists, but instead how to promote entrepreneurial creativity and coordination. Consequently, in the field of social ethics, we arrive at the fundamental conclusion that the idea of human beings as creative and coordinating actors implies the axiomatic acceptance of the principle that every human being has a natural right to appropriate all the results of his entrepreneurial creativity. That is, the private appropriation of the fruits of entrepreneurial creation and discovery is a tenet of natural law. And it is a tenet of natural law because if an active person were not able to claim what he creates or discovers, his capacity to detect profit opportunities would become entirely blocked, and his incentive to act would disappear. Moreover, the principle is wholly universal in the sense that it can be applied to all people at all possible times and in all conceivable places. To coerce free human action to any degree by impairing people's right to own what they entrepreneurially create is not only dynamically inefficient, since it obstructs their creativity and coordinating capacity, but also fundamentally immoral, since such coercion prevents human beings from developing that which is by nature most essential in them. It is the innate ability to create and conceive new ends and means, and to act to attempt to achieve their own goals and objectives. Precisely for these reasons, not only socialism, not only interventionism, but all forms of estatism are not only dynamically inefficient, but also ethically unjust and immoral. Thank you. It must be taken into account that the force of entrepreneurial creativity also manifests itself in the desire to help poor people and in the systematic search for situations in which others are in need in order to help them. And we heard Walter Block this morning defending the same idea. In fact, coercive state intervention through the typical mechanisms of the so-called welfare state neutralizes and to a great extent blocks the entrepreneurial effort to help one's neighbors, both close and distant, who are experiencing difficulties. And this is an idea that, for instance, Pope John Paul II very well stressed in section 49 of his 1991 encyclical Centesimus Annus. Furthermore, according to our analysis, nothing is more dynamically efficient than justice, understood in its proper sense. If we think of the market as a dynamic process, then dynamic efficiency, understood as coordination and creativity, results from the behavior of human beings who follow certain moral laws, mainly regarding the respect for life, private property, and the fulfillment of contracts. Only the exercise of human action, subject to these ethical principles, gives rise to a dynamically efficient social process. And it is now easy to see why, from a dynamic standpoint, efficiency is not compatible with different models of equity or justice, as the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics erroneously states. But instead, efficiency arises only from one idea of justice, that based on the respect for private property, entrepreneurship, and as we will see in a moment, also the principles of personal morality. Therefore, the contradiction between efficiency and justice is plainly false. What is just cannot be inefficient, and what is efficient cannot be unjust. A dynamic analysis reveals that justice and efficiency are but two sides of the same coin, which also confirms the consistent, integrated order that exists in the spontaneous social universe of human interactions. Now let us conclude with some ideas on the last field in which I am making my research, on the relationship between dynamic efficiency and the principles of personal morality, especially in the field of family and sexual relations. Up to this point, we have looked at social ethics and discussed the key principles which provide the framework that makes dynamic efficiency possible. Outside of that realm lie the most intimate principles of personal morality. The influence of principles of personal morality on dynamic efficiency has rarely been studied, and in any case they are considered to be separate and different from social ethics. However, I believe this separation to be completely unjustified. In fact, there are moral principles which are of great importance to the dynamic efficiency of any society, which are subject to the following apparent paradox. The failure to uphold them on a personal level entails a huge cost in terms of dynamic efficiency. But at the same time, the attempt to impose these moral principles using the force of the state or of a private agency generates even more severe inefficiencies from the dynamic point of view. Hence, certain social institutions are needed to transmit and encourage the observance of these personal moral principles, which by their very nature cannot be imposed by violence or coercion, but are nevertheless of great importance, of vital importance to the dynamic efficiency of every society. It is mainly through religion and the family that human beings, generation after generation, are able to internalize these principles and thus learn to keep them and transmit them to their children. The principles which relate to sexual morality, the creation and preservation of the family institution, the faithfulness between spouses, and the care of children, the control of our atavistic instincts, and specifically the overcoming and restraint of envy, are all of crucial importance to every successful social process of creativity and coordination. For an illustration of the importance of analyzing personal moral principles in terms of the theory of dynamic efficiency, let us consider, for example, the behavior of spouses should aspire to, with consistent effort, in order to keep their marriages going and preserve the institution of the family, not only for their own benefit, but especially for that of their children. We can ask ourselves, for example, what happens to dynamic efficiency if, for example, husbands abandon their wives and families to live with new, more attractive younger women? Something very natural, of course. So from the start, wives will then be aware of the high risk that precisely when they are getting older and the children are nearly grown, their husbands may divorce them. If such immoral behavior becomes widespread, not only will a larger number of marriages and families be broken up, but even more significantly, the rate at which new marriages and families are started will decline, and women will tend to prolong their single life to ensure their professional careers and independent means of support, all of which will lead to a dramatic drop in the birth rate. In the absence of migratory trends to ease this decrease in the birth rate and the consequent aging of the population, the social process of entrepreneurial creativity and coordination, which promotes dynamic efficiency, will be impaired. And as Hayek taught us, both the progress of civilization and economic and social development require a constantly expanding population capable of sustaining among a continually increasing number of people the steady growth in the volume of social knowledge which entrepreneurial creativity generates. Dynamic efficiency depends on people's creativity and capacity for coordination, and other things being equal, it will tend to increase as the number of human beings increases, which can only happen within a certain framework of moral principles to govern family relationships. However, as I have already stated, this is a kind of a paradox. The entire framework of personal moral principles cannot be imposed by force or violent coercion. The imposition of moral principles by the force or coercion would only give rise to a closed, inquisitorial society that would deprive human beings of the individual freedoms which comprise the foundations of entrepreneurship and dynamic efficiency. This fact precisely reveals the importance of alternative, non-coercive methods of social guidance, which expose people to the most intimate and personal moral principles and encourage their internalization and observance. Religious feelings and principles, which are acquired at an early age within the family, play an indispensable role in this regard, together with the social pressure exerted by other members of the family, the local community, and so on. Religious precepts provide direction under which to act, help people control their most atavistic impulses, and serve as a guide in the selection of those human beings of the opposite sex with whom we decide to build a family for the rest of our lives. And we can conclude that other things being equal, the firmer and more enduring personal moral principles are, the greater the dynamic efficiency of a society will tend to be. Thank you very much.